The very end of the Han Dynasty was followed by what we call the Three Kingdoms period of ancient Chinese history. This is one of the most celebrated periods in world history, not just Chinese history or even Asian history, but people for centuries throughout China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam have looked to the heroes from this period of Chinese history as kind of the ideal warriors, the ideal men and women, especially when it comes to Confucian ideology. So this period of time is very, very, very important in shaping the thinking of later generations. In order to really understand this period and its significance culturally, I'd like to talk about the three sworn brothers, Liu Bei, Guan Yu, Zhang Fei. These are the greatest heroes in Chinese history and will be celebrated for almost 2 millennia after their life and times. These are people who lived in the late 2nd, early 3rd century AD, and they are still very much the quintessential Chinese heroes. So there are three sworn brothers who take an oath to try to save the Han Dynasty from destruction. This is during the period of the epidemic that I had talked about in the last video, when the great mystic Zhang Jue raised up a rebellion, and because he could cure this disease, the people followed him, and he set about trying to destroy the Han Dynasty. Well, they advocated for saving it, and they raised up arms and raised troops and went onto the battlefield and engaged in a lot of mighty exploits for the next 30 years, attempting to protect the Han Dynasty from ruin. So who are these three brothers? Well, one of the brothers was Guan Yu. He is kind of like the Superman of ancient China. He was a great, massive, tall warrior. He's portrayed as having a red face because he had a great hot temper and a very, very long beard. He's very muscular. He wields a crescent-shaped guandao, which is kind of like a sword on a pole. In the Western equivalent of that weapon is called a glaive. And he would later become celebrated as the Taoist god of war. He's one of the strongest warriors in Chinese history. He was a real historical person. We know that he fought in many battles in this period of time, but we're not just focusing on who he was historically. We're looking at the persona, the myth that would develop later, because it's important to know what animates so much of the world. Guan Yu was a very fiery figure who was a hard-drinking, hard-fighting, but caring, kind, and noble soul. Right? He was a good person who fought to defend his brothers and to defend the Han Dynasty. He was extraordinarily tough. For example, there was a famous doctor named Hua Tuo, who was also a real historical figure. Hua Tuo ended up actually operating on Guan Yu, scraping the gangrene off of the bone on his arm during an operation. And according to the famous story, Guan Yu sat there playing Go, drinking, eating, while he played this game with not Go, the predecessor of Go, with his friend, right? And he's just drinking and having a ball while this very, very painful procedure is taking place, and he's not flinching. Well, Guan Yu is kind of the quintessential loyal fighter. Okay? The next brother we're going to talk about is Zhang Fei. If Guan Yu was the Superman of ancient China, Zhang Fei was the Hulk. He epitomized brute strength. This is actually a 19th century Japanese painting by Utagawa Kunisada, one of the famous Edo artists from that period of time. And Zhang Fei, like Guan Yu, was celebrated throughout East Asian societies for century after century after century. Zhang Fei was different from his brothers in that he was very, very rash, very, very brave, very, very reckless, but also very, very skilled at fighting. However, he was loyal to the Han Dynasty and loyal to his brothers without fault. And I'll give a kind of a characteristic feat by Zhang Fei, the Battle of Changban Bridge, when the northern force from Wei was attacking Liu Bei, his sworn brother's position. Zhang Fei went out onto Changban Bridge, and he stood entirely by himself, facing down thousands of enemy soldiers, and he said, anyone who wants to challenge me can come and fight me in a one-on-one fight. Now, in this period of time, generals often would duel each other before the battles began, and if a general didn't go to battle to duel, the men would often lose heart or lose faith in that general. And none of the enemy generals, out of the hundreds that were present, would come and actually do battle with him. So it was very demoralizing, and for a while the Wei army was trapped on the other side of the bridge, and his sworn brothers and their armies were able to escape because of this heroic stand he took. I've got here this image of a magic card, but and I put this kind of fun image in because it's a sign of just how important this character is still today. This is somebody who, just like with the Funko Pop of Guan Yu, this is somebody that's celebrated, that little kids will play with toys of Zhang Fei. There have been thousands of comics, thousands of video games, many, many movies, including a full-budget film by John Woo that was made about 12 years ago. It was absolute blockbuster worldwide, and I have some clips from that I'm going to put into the supplemental videos. But this man is kind of the epitome of brute strength, but also kind of rash loyalty and recklessness. The third of the sworn brothers was Liu Bei. Liu Bei was the leader of the trio, and he would eventually become the emperor of the breakaway state of Shu Han in southwestern China, after the Han dynasty fell in the north. Liu Bei was a member of the imperial family, and more so than any other figure in Chinese literature, drama, etc., Liu Bei is the ideal Confucian ruler. He's very compassionate towards the people. He's ready to give his own life in defense of the people around him. I'll give an example. There's one part where his army's being chased. They're in retreat. They're being chased by the army of this kind of northern tyrant, Cao Cao. And historically, he could be seen as both a tyrant and kind of a visionary. In literature, he's usually portrayed as the bad guy. Cao Cao is driving his army towards Liu Bei's. And one of the reasons that Liu Bei's army is moving so slowly is because the common people who love Liu Bei and love living under his rule, they're following his army. And he's unwilling to abandon the people. They're children, they're elderly, and he says, I'm not going to abandon the people. My army is going to protect them as we retreat south. And his advisor, Zhuge Liang, whom we'll talk about in a moment, says, well, hey, if we don't ditch the people, the enemy are going to overtake us. And he said, well, if we can't defend the people, why are we even fighting this war to begin with? And of course, everybody was moved because Liu Bei told them what the priority was. The priority was to protect the people. So he's this great hero. He's analogous to King Arthur. Right? He's too good for this world. Right? He is virtuous to a fault. So Liu Bei is the oldest brother, and the reason that we call them sworn brothers is due to an oath they took. As you recall in the last lecture, the Han dynasty was facing collapse. There was this massive yellow scarves or yellow turban rebellion. It's been translated with both terms. The regional warlords had seized control from the central government, and so with the land in disarray, the three brothers took an oath in which they would agree to give their lives to fight to save the Han dynasty. Because they took this oath in a peach garden, we call this the Peach Garden Oath. And it's one of the most dramatic moments in both Chinese history, which it really historically happened, and in Chinese literature. Now I have to stop and talk for a minute about sworn brotherhood. This is part of East Asian culture that still exists today. And it's this idea of being very, 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 very close friends with, and women do this too, with sworn sisterhood. Sworn siblings are both sexes, but being very, very close to someone and swearing an oath of brotherhood or sisterhood with them to where they enter into your family. Right? And this is a Confucian value system where family comes first over the welfare of the individual and over just about everything else. So you're kind of grafting this person into your top priority. In fact, your sworn sibling is supposed to come before your actual blood. These are very, very rare. You're supposed to be once in a lifetime features of a person's life. And so many great heroes throughout history have sworn these oaths of brotherhood. And this is what these three men are doing. They're swearing an oath of brotherhood to support each other, to give their lives fighting for the enemies of the Han Dynasty. And I have to talk about another ally they had, who was not one of the sworn brothers, but nevertheless a very important general. His name was Zhou Yun. And he was up there with the three brothers in terms of his importance, and with the two stronger of the three brothers, Guan Yu and Zhang Fei, in terms of his ability as a warrior. And he's like the ancient equivalent of maybe somebody like the Flash. He's kind of a young hothead, but who was very handsome and very charming. He ends up living to a very old age, dueling enemy soldiers into his 60s, which, considering the fact that he lived in the 3rd century, we know this is an historical fact, that's pretty impressive. I'm showing all these images from toys, games, comics, etc., films, just to emphasize how culturally relevant these figures are and why it's good to know about them. One of the great exploits of Zhou Yun is at the Battle of Changban Bridge that I alluded to earlier, where Zhang Fei yelled at the enemy army on the bridge and Liu Bei refused to abandon the people at great personal risk. Zhou Yun actually rescued Liu Bei's son, an infant, Liu Chan. What had happened is Lady Mi, Liu Bei's wife, was cornered by the enemy. Her carriage was attacked. She ends up, Zhou Yun goes to rescue her. She's wounded. He can't get away with both her and the baby because the enemy is surrounding. So she gives him the baby, has him promise that he will bring the baby back to Liu Bei to safety, and then he insists on bringing her with him, but she refuses, and she ends up flinging herself down a well to keep her body from being violated, and so that he would not waste any more time trying to save her. So he wraps the baby around his armor. He actually puts him inside his breastplate, and he ends up charging through this huge cavalry army with literally thousands of soldiers trying to kill him, shooting at him, and he fights his way through, killing enemy general after enemy general, until he eventually makes his way back to Liu Bei and gives him his baby, gives him his son. And so this is one of the great feats of the Chinese tradition. It's dramatized thousands of times in poetry, in drama, in film. The greatest enemy of these heroes was the general Cao Cao. Cao Cao was the son of a eunuch in the late Han Dynasty who had served Emperor Ling. Cao Cao was originally a cavalry commander, and he rose through the ranks, eventually becoming a very powerful general. He ended up defeating most of his rivals and unifying the northern half of China. He had inherited this period of massive civil war and chaos, and he ended up reinstating order via legalist principles. So he had very strict laws, very strict systems of rewards and punishments. He took the Han Emperor into his custody, and while on the one hand he claimed to serve the Han Emperor as a loyal subject, at the same time real power was vested in himself. And he waged war against separatist-minded warlords like Liu Bei and Sun Quan to the south. And it was through his efforts that the mechanism of reunification happened. So ultimately his son, Cao Pi, ended up overthrowing the last Han Emperor, Emperor Xian, and instituting the Wei dynasty. And we call this Northern Wei. So we have a period in which the Han dynasty is usurped by the Cao clan. In the southwest, Liu Bei, the leader of the three brothers, declares himself a kind of revived Han emperor. We call this the Shu Han Empire. And in the southeast, we have the Wu Empire, ruled by Sun Quan, who was a descendant of Sun Tzu, the great military strategist. Cao Cao won victory after victory. He defeated all of the warlords of the north. He had amassed an inassailable army and navy. And of course, he drove Liu Bei even further and further south. Liu Bei ends up retreating, and he's essentially doomed. There's no way that Cao Cao will not hunt him down and kill him. However, he ends up finding a great strategist, a man named Zhuge Liang, who is one of the greatest heroes in Chinese history. He was a great genius. He was a real person. He invented a number of inventions, including a repeating crossbow, a crossbow that you basically hold down the trigger and it shoots bolt after bolt after bolt. He also invented something called a juggernaut, which was kind of a flamethrower that was kind of a moving lion statue that had combustibles inside that could spit fire at enemy troops. But Zhuge Liang was very intelligent, and he fought war in both a Confucian and a Taoist way. He used his mind to defeat the enemy. So he set up lots of fire traps on the battlefield, and he advised Liu Bei in how to deal with Cao Cao. He ends up allying with the other warlord in the southeast, Sun Quan, and they deal a massive surprise defeat to Cao Cao at the Battle of Red Cliff. And this is one of the greatest battles in the history of China and indeed of the world. In fact, the build-up to this battle is one of the most celebrated events in the history of Chinese literature. So I will just provide a brief description of what happened. Well, Liu Bei and Sun Quan, two warlords from the south, Liu Bei being the leader of the three sworn brothers, and Zhou Yun, Zhuge Liang, and this army of Han loyalists. He allied with Sun Quan, a warlord who led a group of militarily astute southerners, and they fought a naval battle against Cao Cao's fleet, and they tricked Cao Cao in many different ways. For example, the Wu strategist under Sun Quan, the Wu strategist Zhou Yu, he ended up convincing Cao Cao to execute the southerners that Cao Cao had forced to surrender to lead his fleet. Now, the northerners were great at land warfare, but they were not good on the water. So they needed southerners Cao Cao needed southerners to command his navy. And fortunately for Cao Cao, several southern commanders surrendered to him when he moved into south-central China. Zhou Yu, the great strategist for Sun Quan, for the southerners, ends up tricking Cao Cao into executing his naval commanders by essentially through espionage. Cao Cao sends one of Zhou Yu's old friends, who has been a turncoat, to go visit him, and they hang out together and drink together and party together, and Cao Cao leaves a letter out, which is basically a letter to himself from these southern commanders who surrendered. And they say, well, we're going to betray Cao Cao at the right moment. Of course, it's a fake letter. It's completely forged, but this spy goes back to Cao Cao and he says, hey, these guys are planning to betray you. So Cao Cao says, hey, get rid of them immediately, off with their heads. And then once they've been executed, he realizes that he's been had. Zhou Yu actually tricked him into killing the only competent naval commanders he had. Secondly, a spy named Pang Tung, who was kind of heralded as kind of like Zhuge Liang, except less intellectually astute. He ends up convincing Cao Cao to chain his ships together. The way he does this is that the northerners, being unused to being on ships, they end up having motion sickness, right? Seasickness, even though they're on a giant river. The Yangtze River is very large. You can have a naval battle at many different points along the river. So these northerners are experiencing seasickness. Cao Cao ends up chaining his ships together to make them more sturdy, to make them more stable. And of course, that does get rid of their seasickness. The problem is that the ships can't get away from one another. So when the Wu Navy, Wu being led by Sun Quan, who was the ally of Liu Bei, he sends a flaming ship into the Wei Navy, Cao Cao's navy. It ends up catching fire, catching the Wei Navy on fire, and they can't pull away because they're chained together. So this huge navy of several hundred ships, huge ships, goes up in flames. Thousands and thousands of northern soldiers die in the fire, and it's a huge defeat. Cao Cao is forced to retreat back to the north in shame, and while he's fleeing, Liu Bei takes the southwest, and Sun Quan reasserts his control over the southeast. So we end up with three kingdoms: Wei in the north, Wu in the southeast, and Shu, or Shu Han, in the southwest. Shu being a continuation of the Han dynasty. So these three kingdoms make war against one another. The alliance between Shu and Wu was already breaking down before the victory at Red Cliffs. In fact, there's a very famous episode in which Zhou Yu, the strategist for Wu under the warlord Sun Quan, Zhou Yu was so worried about Zhuge Liang, the great genius strategist under Liu Bei. He was so worried about his intellect and his ability that he attempted to kill him, and he intended to do it through schemes. He made Zhuge Liang promise on pain of death that he would secure 100,000 arrows for the army, and he gave him 3 days to do it, and he gave him meager supplies, meager craftsmen, and he expected Zhuge Liang to fail to produce these arrows. And of course that would mean, under Chinese military law, if he had agreed, I will do this or I'll die trying, then his life would be forfeit. Instead of trying to manufacture these arrows, Zhuge Liang had several ships covered in straw and bales of hay, and during the cover of a great fog, he was a kind of an ancient meteorologist, a Taoist mystic who also knew about weather patterns. Under the cover of a great fog, he sails out, and he pretends to attack the Wei positions, Cao Cao's positions on the other side of the river, and he ends up being pummeled by crossbow bolts. But he's got his ships covered with bales of hay. So these arrows are and crossbow bolts, both arrows and crossbow bolts, are actually being collected by himself. So he ends up absorbing the 100,000 arrows with his ships, and then he sails back to camp and he says, "Here, Supreme Commander, here are the arrows and bolts that you requested." And so everyone's kind of astounded that he thought up this crafty plan to get out from under this rivalry, right? But so that's the kind of warfare that was typical in this era, right? Where the great general fights with his mind. Sun Tzu said, a great plan is to attack a strategy. A poor one is to attack a castle, right? So, and Sun Tzu also said that the greatest generals win without fighting, right? So the idea is that you're going to use your mind, you're going to be clever, you're going to use your intellect, not necessarily your strength. You have to have strength and great warriors like Guan Yu and Zhang Fei, but wars are won with the mind in the traditional Chinese conception of warfare, and this is something that will set East Asia apart from the rest of the world. But the three kingdoms made war against each other, and they essentially fought to ruin. Ultimately, the kingdom of Wei was overthrown by the Sima clan, and eventually the Sima clan established the Jin dynasty after overthrowing the Cao clan, Cao Cao's clan in Wei, and they end up unifying the country and creating the short-lived Jin dynasty, the dynasty that actually reunites the entire realm. Now, I should point out the ruse about the collecting of arrows and bolts. That's not real history, right? That's a folk tale that was attached to the historical figure of Zhuge Liang that persisted throughout the centuries and has been celebrated since then. So it's important to know that these are real historical figures around which an entire mythology has been created. Now, the reason that I mentioned the mythology, the events like the collecting of arrows, now the Battle of Red Cliffs, or the Battle of Chirbi, is real. Well, was real, right? It actually really occurred, and it was a great victory for the Southerners over the Northerners, and deeply upset Cao Cao's plans to unify the country. But the reason that I bring up the mythological aspects, and especially when we look at the next video, is that this is important in understanding Chinese thinking. Right? There was a 14th century novelist named Luo Guanjun. He's one of the most popular novelists in the history of the world, even though many people in the West don't know who he was. He had such an impact in East Asia. His pivotal novel, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, is possibly the most widely read novel in the history of the world. Many people don't know that the novel started in East Asia. We'll talk about the Lady Murasaki and her invention of the novel when we talk about the Tale of Genji and the samurai in Japan. But the great Chinese novel by Luo Guanjun, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, is absolutely celebrated. And these three heroes, Liu Bei, Guan Yu, and Zhang Fei, and of course the other heroes like Zhao Yun and Zhuge Liang, these are, as I stated earlier, huge parts of East Asian culture. Right? So this novel, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, wasn't just an attempt to write about historical characters. It was propaganda against the Mongol Empire, which we'll talk about later. The Mongols had conquered China, and the Cao Cao was kind of a stand-in for the Mongols, and the southern heroes like Liu Bei and Sun Quan are their stand-ins for the Ming Dynasty that started in the south and eventually threw the Mongols out of China. So these stories are being revisited by generation after generation after generation of Chinese thinkers. They're very, very important because they help identify what virtue is, what vice is. Right? These are people who put their families, the collective, the nation above their own welfare. And the three heroes didn't ultimately triumph. They ultimately met tragic fates. But the thing about that is they knew they were going to meet tragic fates, but they did their duty anyway. They were filial anyway. They pursued Confucian virtue anyway, even though they knew that it would eventually lead to their own destruction, because that's the right thing to do. And that's the ethic that has defined traditional Chinese culture from the 3rd century, when these events occurred, into the present. Now, if you go see Chinese opera, chances are the opera is going to be based on an excerpt from Luo Guanjun's novel or some other story related to the Three Kingdoms and these great heroes. If you read Chinese poetry, there's a good chance it will involve some of these characters. So I just wanted people to get an introduction into this great saga, right? Both the historical period that inspired it and the literary tradition that came afterwards. Because you think about something like Star Wars, how important that is to many people. Well, this is the ancient Chinese equivalent of that. This absolutely has every bit of the depth of any kind of modern phenomenon like that.